The Zorathian High Command had studied human warfare for 300 years. They had analyzed every battle, every engagement, and every strategic decision the Terran Imperial fleet had ever made. Their war computers had processed millions of simulations. Their admirals had graduated from the finest military academies in the galaxy. They believed they understood humans completely. They were wrong. Admiral Vexinar stood on the command bridge of the Zorathian flagship Eternal Conquest. Around him, 2,000 warships formed a perfect battle formation. Each vessel held its position with mathematical precision. Their weapons were calibrated to fire in synchronized patterns. Their shields were linked together to create an impenetrable wall of energy. This was how proper civilizations fought wars. This was how the Zorathians had conquered 17 star systems. This was how they would destroy the human fleet. The humans had only 500 ships. The tactical computers gave the Zorathians a 97% probability of victory. Admiral Vexinar allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The humans had been a minor annoyance for too long. Today, that annoyance would end. "Admiral," said his tactical officer, "the human fleet is holding position near the asteroid belt. They are not advancing." Vexinar nodded. "They know they are outmatched. They delay the inevitable. Should we advance and engage?" "No, let them come to us. Our formation is strongest when we maintain position. The humans will have to attack eventually, and when they do, our synchronized fire patterns will destroy them." On the other side of the battlefield, Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship Relentless. She was a small woman with gray hair and calm eyes. She had commanded fleets for 40 years. She had never lost a battle. "Status report," she said quietly. Commander Rodriguez pulled up the tactical display. "The Zorathians are maintaining their standard formation. 2,000 ships arranged in a defensive grid. Linked shields. Synchronized weapons, exactly as our intelligence predicted. Their formation? Perfect. Not a single ship out of position." Admiral Chun smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Perfect formations. How predictable. How boring. The Zorathians had studied human military history, but they had made a critical mistake. They had studied the official records. They had analyzed the formal battles. They had not understood that humans considered rules to be suggestions. They had not learned that humans invented new tactics the way other species breathed air. "Signal the fleet," Admiral Chun ordered. "Execute Operation Chaos." The human fleet did not advance in formation. It exploded. Ships scattered in every direction. Some dove toward the asteroid belt. Others accelerated toward the Zorathian flanks. A group of destroyers turned and flew directly away from the battle. Nothing about their movement made tactical sense. Nothing followed any pattern the Zorathian computers could predict. Admiral Vexinar stared at his tactical display in confusion. "What are they doing?" "Unknown, Admiral. Their movements appear random." "Random? That is not a strategy. That is madness. Should we pursue?" Vexinar hesitated. Pursuing would break their formation. But staying in formation meant letting the humans do whatever they wanted. He chose what seemed like the safer option. Maintain formation. Target the largest group of human ships. The synchronized weapons of the Zorathian fleet opened fire. Thousands of plasma beams lanced across space. They struck the positions where the human ships had been a moment before. But the human ships were no longer there. They had changed direction the instant the Zorathians fired. The plasma beams hid nothing but empty space. "They moved," said the tactical officer, his voice confused. "They changed course without any warning. Target them again." The fleet fired again. Again, the humans dodged. They were not moving in predictable patterns. They were not following any tactical doctrine. Each ship seemed to be making its own decisions, reacting to threats individually rather than as part of a coordinated formation. While the main Zorathian fleet wasted its ammunition on empty space, The human destroyers that had fled were doing something strange. They had circled around the battlefield at maximum speed. They approached the Zorathian fleet from behind, where the linked shields were weakest. "Admiral, we have contacts emerging from our rear." Vexenar spun around. "That is impossible. Those ships fled the battle. They did not flee. They repositioned. The destroyers launched missiles, not at the warships. At the communication satellites that linked the Zorathian fleet together. The satellites exploded in silent flashes of light. Suddenly, the synchronized shield network began to fail. Ships that had been sharing power were now operating alone. "Restore communications," Vexenar shouted. "We are trying." "The humans are jamming all frequencies." The jamming was not standard electronic warfare. Human engineers had spent years developing signal disruption technology that specifically targeted Zorathian communication systems. They had stolen the frequencies from captured ships. They had built jammers that spoke the Zorathian language of war and told lies. With their coordination broken, the Zorathian fleet began to make mistakes. Ships fired at targets that other ships were already engaging, wasting ammunition. Shields failed because power was not being shared properly. Captains made contradictory decisions because they could not receive orders from the flagship. Admiral Chun watched the chaos spreading through the enemy fleet. "Phase 2, she ordered. "Release the drones." From the cargo bays of human cruisers, thousands of small drones emerged. They were tiny machines, barely larger than a human fist. They carried no weapons. They carried something worse: confusion. The drones flew toward the Zorathian fleet and began transmitting false sensor readings. Suddenly, Zorathian tactical displays showed human ships everywhere. Ghost images multiplied across their screens. Ships that did not exist appeared to be attacking from every direction. "Admiral, our sensors are compromised. Switch to visual targeting." "We cannot." "The drones are releasing reflective particles." Visual confirmation is impossible. The Zorathian fleet was blind. They were deaf. They were alone. And the humans were just getting started. Admiral Chun had studied Zorathian psychology as carefully as the Zorathians had studied human tactics. She knew that Zorathian officers were trained to follow orders. They were trained to maintain formation. They were trained to trust their systems. When those systems failed, they did not know how to adapt. Humans were different. Human officers were trained to think independently. Human captains were expected to make their own decisions when communications failed. Human crews practiced for exactly this kind of chaos, because humans understood that no plan survives contact with the enemy. "Signal the fleet," Chine ordered. "Free hunting. All ships engage at will." The human ships stopped pretending to be random. They became predators. Each captain identified the weakest target they could find and attacked. They did not coordinate. They did not need to. They simply killed. The cruiser Vengeance found a Zorathian battleship with failing shields and tore it apart with concentrated plasma fire. The destroyer pack Eclipse, Nightmare, and Phantom surrounded a carrier and disabled its engines before the crew could react. The battleship, Unconquered, flew directly into the center of the Zorathian formation and released nuclear missiles in every direction, destroying itself along with 12 enemy vessels. Admiral Vexenar watched his fleet die around him. "This is not warfare," he whispered. "This is butchery." His tactical officer had no response. He was too busy staring at the casualty reports scrolling across his screen. "Order all ships to break formation and retreat," Vexenar finally commanded. "We must regroup." But breaking formation was exactly what Admiral Chun wanted. The moment the Zorathian ships began to scatter, the human fleet changed tactics again. They had been fighting as individuals. Now, they formed hunting packs, groups of 3 or 4 ships that worked together to isolate and destroy fleeing enemies. The asteroid belt became a killing ground. Human ships used the rocks as cover, appearing suddenly to launch attacks and then disappearing again. The Zorathian captains had never trained for this kind of fighting. They did not know how to hide. They did not know how to hunt. They only knew how to stand in formation and die. 3 hours after the battle began, it was over. The Zorathian fleet had been destroyed. Of 2,000 ships, fewer than 300 escaped. The humans had lost 87 vessels. The casualty ratio was beyond anything the Zorathian High Command had imagined possible. Admiral Chun stood on her bridge and watched the last enemy ships flee. "Send a message to High Command," she said. "Tell them the Zorathian 7th Fleet no longer exists." "Yes, Admiral. Anything else?" Chun considered for a moment. "Yes. Tell them to start planning the counter-invasion." The Zorathians left their border undefended when they sent this fleet. It would be rude not to accept their invitation. Across the galaxy, the Zorathian High Command received reports of the disaster. They analyzed the battle data. They tried to understand what had happened. Their computers identified the human tactics as illogical, inefficient, and contrary to all principles of organized warfare. They were correct. Human tactics were illogical by Zorathian standards. That was why they worked. The Zorathians had built their military around the concept of perfect coordination. Every ship knew its role. Every captain followed orders. Every battle was a mathematical equation to be solved. They believed this was the superior way of war because it was orderly and predictable. Humans believed something different. Humans believed that war was chaos. They believed that the side which created the most chaos would win. They trained their officers to embrace confusion, to find opportunity in disorder, to adapt faster than their enemies could react. The Zorathian admirals held emergency meetings. They redesigned their tactics. They studied human psychology. They tried to become unpredictable themselves, but they failed. They could imitate human chaos, but they could not truly understand it. Unpredictability was not something that could be programmed into a war computer. It had to be felt. It had to be lived. It had to be human. Within a year, the Terran Imperial fleet had pushed deep into Zorathian territory. They did not fight fair. They did not fight honorably. They fought to win. They used tricks and traps and tactics that no civilized species would consider acceptable. They turned the Zorathians' own rules against them. And in the end, when the Zorathian High Command finally surrendered, they asked only one question. They asked Admiral Chun how humans had become so unpredictable. How had they developed tactics that no computer could anticipate? How had they learned to fight without rules? Admiral Chun smiled that unfriendly smile again. "You studied our battles," she said. "You should have studied our games. Humans invented games where the only rule is that there are no rules. We call them children's games. Every human child learns to cheat before they learn to walk. You thought you were fighting soldiers. You were fighting an entire species of creative liars." The Zorathian commander considered this. He looked at the human fleet that had destroyed his empire. He thought about the years of study that had proven worthless. He thought about the tactics that had made no sense but had won anyway. "Your species is terrifying," he said finally. "Thank you," Admiral Chen replied. "We try." The war ended that day. The Zorathians signed a treaty that gave humans everything they wanted. They agreed to never attack human territory again. They agreed to share their technology and their resources. They agreed to become allies rather than enemies. And they agreed privately, among themselves, to never play games with humans. Some competitions, they decided, were simply not worth winning.